November 1944, Western Germany, the Hürtgen Forest sector east of the Belgian border. U.S. Army infantry divisions are being committed in sequence to fight through dense conifer woods, broken ground, and limited roads. The operational purpose is tied to the approach routes toward the Ruhr River and the broader effort against the West Wall, under worsening winter weather that frequently limits air support and observation. In that setting, a young rifleman from Iowa is one of many ordinary infantrymen whose war is recorded less in after-action summaries than in the mail he sends home. He is not a strategist. He is not a planner. He is a worker with a rifle, a pack, and a slot in a squad. His daily life is shaped by tasks that do not look heroic in retrospect. Standing watch, dragging wire, checking rations, filling canteens, cleaning a weapon in damp air that never seems to dry. By late 1944 U.S., the forces have already been fighting for months in France and Belgium. Supplies move forward, but the pace of advance and the churn of casualties create constant strain on the infantry system. In the forest, that strain becomes more visible because the environment punishes every routine. The forest is not open country. There are few roads, few long sight lines, and limited space for vehicles to maneuver. Mud and cold turn footpaths into channels, and each shell burst throws splinters into the air. So under the trees, artillery fragments do not always travel sideways. They can come down through branches, and men learn the meaning of a tree burst without needing the term explained. The rifleman carries what the system tells him to carry: a rifle and ammunition, a shovel, a poncho, extra socks if he can keep them dry, rations that taste the same in every country, a helmet that amplifies rain until it sounds like a drum. He also carries paper when it is available. Thus, that matters more than it seems. In an infantry unit, mail is not merely comfort. It is part of discipline and endurance. It is something a man can finish in the dark without moving from his hole. It is proof that time is still passing in a recognizable way. The Army's wartime mail system has rules designed for security and volume. Letters are routed through numbered Army post offices. Some mail is reviewed under censorship procedures. V-mail exists as a special process meant to save cargo space by microfilming letter sheets, then printing them back to paper on the other end. It is efficient in theory, but it has limitations. It cannot easily carry keepsakes or enclosed items, and the machinery requires standardized sheets. For infantrymen at the front, theory is always less important than whether a runner appears with a sack. Mail comes irregularly. It can arrive all at once or not at all. Yet the rifleman learns not to expect it on a schedule. He writes anyway. He writes when the platoon is pulled back for a brief rest. He writes when a new batch of letter sheets appears, and he can borrow a pencil. He writes in cramped spaces, pressed against a tree trunk, the paper shielded from drizzle under a helmet brim. His handwriting changes with the weather. In dry quarters, it is steadier. In the forest, it becomes smaller and tighter, as if the page itself must be defended. He keeps his lines careful. Every soldier learns what not to say. No unit locations, no operational details, no mention of targets that would matter to an enemy reader. Even when censorship is not visible, the rules live in the back of the mind. The content is routine because the days are routine. Ration issue. A march. A muddy halt. A night of listening for movement. A morning of trying to light a small heat source without showing flame. That routine is the first way the operational problem appears. The infantry is asked to do work that depends on visibility, coordination, and speed. The forest removes visibility, disrupts coordination, and punishes speed. In open terrain, a squad can orient by distant landmarks. Here, landmarks are trunks and stumps. In open terrain, a platoon can spread with some confidence that adjacent units are aligned. Here, the forest absorbs sound and hides movement. Men drift off line by degrees. And degrees become separation. The rifleman's squad is trained to advance, to cover, to move in bounds. In the Hürtgen sector, advance often means stepping into a narrow cut between trees and hoping the next depression is not mined. The first signs of failure are small. A radio that works poorly under canopy, a messenger who takes longer than expected, a stretcher route that collapses into a churned slope. Then the signs become harder to ignore. A casualty that cannot be evacuated until dark, a resupply that arrives short, a replacement who arrives without the shared habits of the unit, learning under fire what others learned in stateside fields. The rifleman sees the system's seams not as a complaint, but as an observation. He is young enough that he still expects the system to be whole. The forest teaches him it is assembled from parts that can slip. He writes home about cold rather than fear. That is common. What's cold feels safer to admit. Cold can be described without betraying anything. He describes wet wool. He describes boots that never fully dry. He describes the careful routine of foot care, because in this kind of campaign, feet are a form of readiness. An infantryman who cannot walk is not merely injured. He is removed from the unit's work. He becomes a burden on evacuation lines that are already strained. And in the forest, evacuation lines are never simple. The rifleman learns to treat socks as equipment. He learns to keep a pair in a sealed container when possible. He learns to change them under a poncho, in a shallow hole, without exposing bare skin longer than necessary. These are not heroic actions. They are the core of infantry life in winter. Around him, the forest keeps making its own weather. Mist hangs low. Rain turns to sleet. Snow sticks on branches and shakes loose with each concussion. Mud swallows anything set down carelessly. The squad's work remains direct. Security, patrols, listening posts, clearing small pockets of resistance that do not show on simple maps. German defenses in the area include mines, wire, and prepared positions, some improvised, some tied to the broader West Wall system. Infantrymen meet those defenses at close range, not in sweeping maneuvers. In short, grinding steps. When artillery fires, it is not a distant sound. It is a physical event. Tree branches shatter into splinters, and the air fills with fragments that are hard to see until they hit. The rifleman's hole becomes less like shelter and more like a place to endure noise. He hugs the earth because the earth is the only reliable cover. He learns to listen for incoming rounds, not because it always helps, but because listening gives the mind a job. He writes to Iowa when he can. He writes about food when the food is decent. He writes about not being hungry even when he is tired. He writes about the men in his squad with the careful restraint that suggests he knows families read between lines. Sometimes he writes a name and then scratches it out. He learns that paper can outlast memory, and he does not want to write what he cannot later defend. By December, the problem escalates. The Hürtgen fighting is not one neat battle. It is a series of attacks, limited objectives, withdrawals, and renewed commitments that bleed strength. A division goes in and comes out reduced. But another goes in. The forest does not care which shoulder patch is present. The rifleman sees men disappear from his daily routine. A seat on a log no longer used, a buddy's kit redistributed. A spare pair of socks passed along as quietly as if it were a formal handover. Loss becomes administrative as well as emotional. A roll call with fewer answers. A new roster. A replacement list pinned somewhere under shelter, guarded from rain like a sacred text. Here, the tension between doctrine and reality grows sharper. Doctrine assumes lines that can be mapped. In the forest, lines are felt more than seen. Doctrine assumes controlled fields of fire. In the forest, fields of fire end at the next trunk. Doctrine assumes that supporting arms can be coordinated with clear observation. In the forest, observers struggle to see, and weather often limits aircraft. Doctrine assumes that infantry can exploit success. In the forest, even success is slow, and every yard is paid for twice. The rifleman is not writing doctrine. He is living the friction it cannot fully address. He notes simple things, that a compass matters, that a map is never enough, that the sound of a machine gun can be hard to locate in wet timber, that a wounded man is difficult to carry when every step is slick. He also notices the official language that arrives through briefings and rumors. He hears objectives described in terms that sound clean. A road center, a ridge, a village. In his experience, each objective is a place where trees have been cut by shellfire and where the ground is torn open. The problem repeats. An assault begins. Men move forward in short rushes. A mine goes off. A squad pauses, and the pause invites fire. A casualty is pulled back. Another man steps into the role without ceremony. There is no single moment that defines this for him. It is accumulation. It is waking up cold every day and having to make the same body do the same work. By mid-December 1944, the campaign is still grinding, even as other events are gathering elsewhere. The rifleman does not know what higher headquarters knows. He knows only that the forest keeps demanding more. This is where the turning point in his daily life arrives, quietly. It is not a grand revelation. It is an unofficial adjustment. He begins writing differently, not more dramatically, more practically. He writes shorter letters because paper is scarce and time is uncertain. He writes in a way that can survive interruption, a page that can end at any moment if movement is ordered. He also begins keeping a mental list of what can be said and what cannot. He learns that families at home want detail, but detail can become dangerous. So he writes about tasks. He writes about how the men keep their rifles functioning in wet conditions. He writes about the routine of cleaning weapons with limited supplies. He writes about shaving when possible, well, because lice and skin infections are not small matters in sustained field conditions. This is infantry life at the system level, a constant maintenance of bodies and tools, a constant negotiation with mud, cold, and exhaustion. Risk becomes personal, without melodrama, when he realizes that mail is one of the few things he can control. He cannot control the shelling. He cannot control the route chosen by planners. He can control whether a letter leaves his pocket, so he protects it. He keeps it wrapped, tucked in a waterproof bag if he has one. He waits for the moment when outgoing mail is gathered, and he does not miss that moment if he can help it. On the back end, the system does its work. Letters are collected. They move through Army post offices. They may be screened, and certain kinds of mail, like V-mail, are processed through microfilming meant to save shipping space. The numbers involved are vast, and the process is industrial, even if the writing is intimate. But the rifleman does not see the machines. He sees only delay in arrival. He measures the system by the day he receives a sheet with a familiar hand. In the forest, incoming mail can arrive when a unit is already moving. A man receives a letter and does not have time to read it until night. Sometimes he reads by feel rather than by light, tracing lines with a finger. Sometimes he waits until a brief lull, because he needs to keep his head up. When the mail does arrive, it does not erase fear. It does something quieter. It restores continuity. It makes the rifleman feel like he exists in more than one place. By late December, consequences of earlier actions tighten around the infantry. Losses and fatigue accumulate. Procedures become harder to follow exactly, not from indiscipline, but from depletion. A unit that is short of men still has the same frontage. A platoon that is exhausted still has to send patrols. Authority responds the way institutions often respond under stress. With reminders, with orders to maintain standards, with inspections that feel both necessary and impossible. The rifleman sees officers trying to hold the line of procedure. He also sees those officers living in the same mud. Leadership is not comfortable in the Hürtgen. It is simply closer to the men than in many other settings, because the forest compresses everyone into the same narrow lanes. An order comes down about digging positions. An order comes down about staying off obvious trails. An order comes down about maintaining contact with adjacent units. All of it is sensible. All of it is hard. Stakes peak quietly when the rifleman's squad is assigned a stretch of line where the ground is already cratered. Old holes exist, half collapsed. The temptation is to use them rather than dig new ones, but old holes can be registered by enemy fire. Old holes can be poorly placed under trees where bursts shower fragments downward. The rifleman and the men around him make small decisions that are not written in field manuals. Move the hole a yard, angle the entrance away from the likely direction of fire. Keep a grenade within reach, but not so close that it becomes a hazard in panic. They also negotiate with their own bodies. A man who is too cold stops thinking clearly. A man who is too tired stops paying attention. So they trade watches. They wake each other. They keep routines because routines prevent mistakes. At some point, the rifleman writes a letter he is not sure will go out. He writes it anyway. It contains no secrets. It contains no drama. It contains only the steady record of a day lived under strain. He writes that it is cold. He writes that the ground is wet. He writes that he is well, because that is what a family needs to read. He writes that he received a package, or hopes to, and he mentions small items, socks, candy, a magazine, because small items are large in the forest. He may be using V-mail letter sheets if those are what his unit has, because V-mail is designed to save space and move large volumes efficiently. If he is using V-mail, he cannot include extras, because the process discourages enclosed objects and depends on standard handling. If he is using regular mail, he still must keep it simple, because the system is overloaded and the front is unstable. He learns that official channels can be both reliable and fragile, reliable in their scale, fragile in how easily weather and combat disrupt them. In this phase, pushback from procedure appears in small forms. A clerk refuses a letter with an enclosure. A supervisor insists on the correct format. A reminder is issued about not mentioning locations. To the rifleman, this can feel distant from the mud, but he also understands, in a practical way, that the system must protect itself. Mail is a vulnerability, as well as a comfort. A unit's morale depends on it. Security depends on it too. The forest continues to impose its own verdict. Operations in that sector are measured in dates that blur together. From September into December, the fighting has been sustained and the cost has been heavy. The public memory later focuses more on the Ardennes, while the Hürtgen is less remembered outside professional circles. For the rifleman, memory is not a later debate. It is immediate. It is a list of men he knew before the forest and fewer men afterward. Yet resolution does not arrive as a triumphant closing. It arrives as change in assignment or withdrawal or a shift in attention as the front reorganizes. In many cases, a unit leaves the forest not because the forest was finished, but because the unit could no longer sustain the effort at its previous strength. The rifleman's letters, if they survive, become a thin thread through a thick event. They do not capture every tactical detail. They capture infantry life as it was actually lived. Short on sleep, short on dryness, heavy on repetition. His family in Iowa reads what he allows them to read. They learn the season through his descriptions. They learn the seriousness through what he does not say. They learn the Army's rhythm through the gaps between envelopes. Afterward, institutions record the Hürtgen in maps, reports, and casualty figures. Those records can explain the operational intentions and the measured results. They can document that the fighting lasted for weeks and that the terrain and weather constrained movement and support. They can describe defenses in mines, wire, and prepared positions. What they cannot fully show is how much of the campaign was made of small, repeated tasks done by young infantrymen. How a rifle was kept functioning when everything was damp. How a position was dug when the ground was half frozen and the shovel struck roots. How a man learned to sleep in minutes, in shifts, with his boots still on. How he wrote home, not to create history, but to stay connected to it. In the quiet legacy of the Hürtgen winter, his mail stands as a record of endurance inside a massive system, a letter sheet that passed through hands, sacks, trucks, and sorting points, a few lines that survived the same war that consumed so many other traces. The rifleman's story is not a single dramatic episode. It is the infantry day, repeated until it becomes a campaign. It is the human cost of terrain and weather, recorded in ordinary language. If this kind of grounded, overlooked infantry history matters to you, subscribe and stay with the channel for more forgotten wartime lives told carefully and without spectacle.